Every coach will come across that client that they just can't seem to get it right with. But I bet that you didn't know that there's at least 2 other types of cueing that you've probably never heard of. There's 3 types of cues that you need to be aware of in order to best be able to apply your coaching to the client you've got in front of you. So these 3 types are internal cues, external cues, and then environmental cues. Everyone knows what internal cues are. It's the first kind of cue you use, and they relate to the client's own body. So you'll tend to use these cues to try to get the client to understand which muscle groups or body segments they should be focusing on during a given lift. Now, it attempts to describe the biomechanics of that lift or a movement. So you'll use these cues if you can notice a lack of activation or use of a certain muscle group, or if you're with a more advanced lifter who has a bit of body awareness about themselves already. So consider internal as your quick fix type of cue. Ideally though, try to minimize using these types of cues when ingraining new movement or dealing with a new client. And the reason for that is that internal cues tend to not last very long term. And if we're dealing with athletes, they tend to break down under pressure. Typical examples are going to be things like hinge at your hips, keep your spine neutral, knees out when you squat, or don't flare your elbows. Each one of those cues relates to a specific body part or segment. That second type of cue was external. Now, external cues have you use words that are more descriptive in nature. Generally, they involve using metaphors or analogies to get your client in the right position or using the right muscle group during their lifts. These can be extremely effective because your client can relate more to what you're asking them to do rather than trying to figure out how to squeeze their glutes or activate their core muscles if they don't have any experience doing so, or they're unable to make that connection in their mind. Now, dissimilar to internal coaching, external coaching is linked more to long-term learning retention and a better performance of the same task when under pressure, or when the coach is not there to continuously provide instruction. So the coach provides a desired outcome and the client creates their own blueprint to get there, rather than being told how to step by step as they would in internal coaching. Typical examples are going to be things like touch your bum to the wall during an RDL, or claw the ground like a chicken, spread the floor mats when squatting to stop your knees caving in, or get your hands away from your hips when trying to get long or tall. So the most effective coaches actually coach less. What I mean by this is that you don't want to overload your client with endless words and endless cues, whether they're internal or external. So often the newer client can feel overwhelmed with the amount of verbal information coming in about how to perform a new exercise or how to execute a lift. So our goal as a coach is to get the client to feel when they are doing something incorrectly so that they are forced into self-correcting. And the best way we can do that is by using our third type of coaching, and that's by shutting our mouths and letting the environment do the talking for us. And this is called environmental cueing, or self-limiting exercise, which is essentially an exercise that stops a client when they're performing an incorrect rep. So we set this up by putting things in place or positioning the client in a certain way that allows the environment to provide feedback to the client when they don't quite get it right. Now, this technically belongs under the banner of external cueing before anyone jumps at me in the comments section, but it's just a more specific branch of it, so it deserves its own little segment in this piece. An unreal example that I and many coaches here have used before is placing a foam roller behind a client and have them attempt to knock it over each rep when doing an RDL, to encourage that hip hinge and translating the hips back through space. The classic band around the knees is another one to avoid our knee valgus when we squat. Or lastly, a mini band under a client's big toe to encourage us setting a nice foot arch when setting up for a squat. So I clearly love an analogy, so I'm going to give you one more to describe all these cues together. Internal cues would describe the process of driving to the learner. So jump in the car, put the key in the ignition, turn it, put it in gear, clutch in, so on. Now, an external cue just basically says get in the car and drive from point A to point B, and lets the learner figure out how to turn the car on, put it in gear themselves. Now, an environmental cue would basically change the roads they drive on so that they can't pick a certain different path to get to point B. So basically, internal cues describe the process, external cues describe the outcome, and environmental cues change or limit our options and provide feedback along the way. So I'm not trying to sway you away from one type of cueing method towards the other. All have their place in the world of coaching. Just know that different clients need a different solution, and only external or only internal isn't necessarily going to work for client A as it would for client B or C or so on. These are all just more tools in your coaching toolbox.